What up, Cavs Nation? I'm your host, Ethan Sands, and I'm back with another episode of the Wine and Gold Talk podcast. I'm joined by your favorite beat reporter, Chris Fedor. How you doing, Chris?
Ethan, man, I'm great. I'm surviving this biblical storm in Northeast Ohio.
Man, it is coming down, and I am just trying to learn how to survive in Cleveland and Ohio weather again. It's been a couple years, but with the winter that we had, I mean, you already know what I had to deal with car situation wise. That's a whole different story. But I wanted to get
Did
into
you
a
go
couple.
outside and look at the hail? Did you look
No,
at it?
no.
Yo, pick up a piece.
Once I heard it, I was like, I'm good. I'm gonna stay inside.
So you know Gobstoppers, the candy?
Yeah.
A little bit bigger than that.
Lord have mercy.
I mean, it's pretty big. My wife went outside.
Crazy.
She picked up a piece and she took a picture of it.
Man, that's crazy. But first off, okay, Chris, I wanted to first of all let the fans know, let the listeners know, like this is gonna be a still 5-day of the week podcast, and I don't know if Cavs fans are used to a podcast or a team oriented show going into the off season. So this is another shameless plug to subscribe to Subtext, where you guys can give us your ideas of what you want us to talk about during this offseason, especially with whatever is going on with this team. And we'll be getting into that today and what the potential options are going to be. But today, Chris, I think we're going to get into the man upstairs, not our Lord and Savior, but Koby Altman. So we're going to talk about his positioning with the team. We're going to probably hear from him later this week, talking to the media about this last season. And I asked our subtexters, what would you want to ask him if you were in our shoes getting to talk to him at the press conference? We'll get into those questions in a bit. But Chris, I wanted to start with the fact that Koby Altman's been here for a while. This team has been able to kind of grow each year that he's been here. Same thing with J.B. Biggerstaff, which we talked about earlier in a recent podcast. What have you thought about the job that Koby Altman has done since he's become a member of the Cavs organization?
I think it's been hit and miss, Ethan. I think he has done a really good job in terms of assembling talent. It's clear that he has an eye for talent. He's very, very good when it comes to scouting. That's a big part of his background. That's something that he takes pride in. He loves going to college basketball games and trying to find some gems. He loves the pre-draft process. He has spoken openly about that. Obviously, he has a bunch of other people inside the front office that he trusts. It's a collaborative effort and all that kind of stuff. But his background is scouting, and you can tell that he has that in his background. But I think the thing that I wonder about Koby is we continue to see how far the Cavs can go in this era and whether they can take the next step and get on the same level with Boston, New York, Philly, Milwaukee. I wonder about team building. I wonder about whether the pieces on the roster fit. It's one thing when you're in the middle of a rebuild and it's the early stages of a rebuild and you're trying to recover from LeBron James leaving again. As the lead executive, you're just trying to assemble talent as best you can. How much talent can we find, whether it's in the draft, free agency, or via trade? Forget about fit. We'll worry about fit down the road. That's kind of how Koby approached it. And you can tell that's how he approached it. But he drafted Colin Sexton in the top 10, and he was a key piece of the Cavs being able to get Donovan Mitchell, right? He pulled off the trade for Lauri Markkanen with the Chicago Bulls, and Markkanen was the centerpiece of the Donovan Mitchell trade. He drafted Darius Garland 5th overall, despite the fact that Darius only played in 4 full college games. He was able to draft Evan Mobley, although you don't want to give a general manager or a president of basketball operations a whole bunch of praise for no-duh moves. Sometimes no duh moves, quote unquote, no duh moves backfire significantly. So we can't just ignore the fact that Kobe was able to acquire Evan Mobley in the draft with the third overall pick. He stole Jared Allen from the Brooklyn Nets in a deal involving James Harden, and everybody was focused on James Harden. Where's James Harden going to go? What kinds of pieces is it going to take in order to get him? And then here comes Kobe, very, very sneakily getting himself in that deal as a third team and stealing Jared Allen. And that's when everything changed for this franchise. So I do think that he has done a really good job in terms of assembling talent. I'm just wondering still whether when it's time to take that step that this organization needs to take, does that talent fit well enough and does he value fit for a basketball team as much as maybe he should?
Yeah, Chris, and I mean, you mentioned some teams that we have looked at that have been able to create their own success based on whether they went and got players in the draft, whether they traded for them, whether they're
Mhm.
homegrown. Like, I'm looking at this game one of the Western Conference series between the Dallas Mavericks and the Minnesota Timberwolves, and this is a pretty good example to me. You got the Timberwolves who went and got Rudy Gobert. They had Cat for 9 years now. He's been through the mud, been through the struggle. Then they went and got Anthony Edwards. He's been an immediate impact for them and is now leading them to their first Western Conference Finals appearance in God knows how long. Like if, and then you look across the ball and you got Dallas Mavericks, Luka Doncic, homegrown. They went and got him and were eyeing him since he was 16 and playing against pros. And then you also got Kyrie Irving, who Cleveland Cavalier fans know and love very, very well. And he's been a guy that's bounced around, but feels like he's finally found his home. And being able to create a comfortability for these kind of players is huge when you're talking about what they're willing to give you in an 82 game season and then also in the playoffs when things have a higher stake. I
Mhm.
think it's really interesting to see what these general managers and upper management have done to go and get their players and be able to build these different rosters. But I want to get into the game itself. I mean, we're sitting here with the Minnesota Timberwolves leading at halftime. We are recording this at halftime of game one. They're leading 62-59 against the Dallas Mavericks. What do you think about this series, Chris, and everything that's tied into it? Because you look at it used to be Dirk Nowitzki versus Kevin Garnett. Now it's Luka Doncic and Anthony Edwards. It's like I've said this a couple times on recent podcasts. You cannot be romantic about sports. It's just the script writing has been exceptional this year. What do you think?
I just like the fact, Ethan, that there's new blood in the NBA playoffs, and no matter who it is, whether it's Dallas, Minnesota, Boston, Indiana, somebody new is going to get a championship ring. Whether it's Tyrese Halliburton, Jason Tatum, Jalen Brown, Anthony Edwards, Luka Doncic, we're talking about this. This is an era in the NBA where I think the collective we are wondering who is going to take the torch from LeBron James, Kevin Durant, Stephen Curry, some of those guys. When they're all done, who is that next guy in line? It could be one of these guys, right? It could be Luca. Although that's a little bit difficult, right? Because it's not an American born player. And I just don't know if a non American can be the face of the NBA. I still wonder about that. But what about Halliburton? He's really, really fun to watch. He plays a fun, engaging style. He jumps around, dances, prances, has joy with the game. From that standpoint, his energy, his personality, some of that is Steph like. And then you talk about Ant. Come on now. Like the ability to lift the Timberwolves from mediocrity the way that he has, the way that he empowers his teammates, the leader that he's become, the scorer that he is, his ability on this postseason stage to look like he belongs. I think that speaks for itself. He is definitely going to be in the running for the next torchbearer. And you can say the same thing about Jason Tatum, right? The one thing that people continue to hold against Tatum is that he hasn't won the ring. He has had a lot of success. He's gotten his team very far in the playoffs, but he doesn't have that championship. If he gets that championship, one, how does the perception change? And two, like what does that do for him in terms of alleviating that pressure and allowing him to play with like a little bit more freedom? Could that open the floodgates to multiple rings for him going forward? And what does that mean in terms of him becoming the face of the NBA? So I just think it's a really exciting time in the league. And I think it's a really interesting time in the league too. And to see a lot of these young players on the biggest stage get this opportunity to show whether or not they're ready to win a championship, that's always something that's very, very exciting for me. And from a Cavs perspective, I think they have to look at it like this, Ethan. There is, okay, so if Boston had Porzingis, I think everybody understands that Porzingis makes Boston a cheat code. But I don't know that they can keep that roster together forever. There are so many salary cap ramifications when you're talking about Jaylen Brown, Jason Tatum, Kristaps Porzingis, Drew Holiday making what he's making, and the list goes on and on and on, right? So beyond Boston with Porzingis, which is a cheat code, and they have shown to be a cheat code, there just isn't that team that's out there that looms the way that the Golden State Warriors did for 4 straight years, or the way that the Cavs did in the Eastern Conference for 4 straight years, where you just felt, okay, why are we even playing in the playoffs? Thanks for participating, Atlanta. Thanks for participating, Indiana. Thanks for participating, Toronto. But you're not getting to the NBA Finals. You're not beating the Cavs. And then you said the same thing out in the Western Conference with all those other teams that were trying to compete with the Warriors, right? It was almost a guarantee, as much as a guarantee can be in sports, that the Cavs and the Warriors were going to meet in June. You don't have that in today's NBA. There's more parity right now. And I think that's a good thing from a Cavs perspective, because it means they don't have to do everything right, right? Their margin for error is a little bit greater because there's just more of an opening if they bring back Donovan Mitchell, if they make the right moves around the margins, if they do the right thing from a coaching perspective. There is room for them to rise up the Eastern Conference and maybe even compete with some of these teams for the Eastern Conference Finals berth. So those are my big 2 takeaways from what I've seen so far in this postseason.
Chris, I mean, you mentioned it about this new era of basketball, these new era of star players. This is the craziest part to me. The oldest player in that group who has gotten the most scrutiny of all of them based on playoff performances is Jason Tatum. Jason Tatum is 26 years old.
I know.
I mean, like, Luka Doncic is 25, Tyrese Halliburton is 24, and Anthony Edwards is barely able to drink. He's 22 years old. Like, It is incredible to see the rise of talent. And let's be really fair, Chris. I don't know if we saw the Indiana Pacers making it to the Eastern Conference Finals when we looked at the brackets on all this starting off the playoffs. Like, they have one, albeit going through a hindered Milwaukee Bucks team. You can't take that away from them. They went and handled their business when they could have fumbled the bag. They went and handled a hindered New York Knicks team that didn't have 4 of its starters in Game 7. That's fine to close the game in Game 7, let's say. But it's just like you think of all the success that these guys have had and these teams. And I wanted to counter your point about Jason Tatum being able to play more loosely if he wins a chip, because I feel like he's a guy that gets a lot of hate for playing too loose as it is and doing whatever he wants. And we saw that in the Boston Celtics Cleveland Cavaliers series when Coach Joe Mazzulla was really waving his arm trying to get JT to run the ball up the floor. And JT said, hold on, coach. I'm going to do my thing. You just watch, and as the kids say nowadays, watch me cook. And, I mean, so that's that. But I think the Cavs can look at all of these things, and I have to touch on this. The Indiana Pacers yesterday shot 3 free throws. 3 free throws in regulation And we remember what happened with the Cavs and how everybody was mad about that. And then a last second 3-point shot by Jaylen Brown put the game to overtime, and you let the Boston Celtics get more minutes with less foul trouble, and it's almost over. But I think the storylines for all of these series are so great because of the star players that they have. And I mean, Jaylen Brown's not old either. So you could throw him into the star conversation if you really wanted to, but we know that Jason Tatum runs that shit. But
here's the other thing that stands out to me. And look, when it comes to success in the NBA, so much of it is predicated on various things, right? Some of it's luck, some of it's talent, some of it is matchups, especially in the playoffs. So you can't look at what one team does and say, all right, we're going to copy that. All right, we're going to build our team that way. Because you have to implement your systems offensively and defensively based on the personnel that you have with your roster. And not everybody can be Minnesota because not everybody has the pieces that Minnesota does to defend the way that the Timberwolves do, right? And not everybody can beat Indiana on the offensive end of the floor because not everybody has an offensive engine, a great pick and roll player like Tyrese Halliburton, and 5 guys that can shoot at basically all times when they go to various lineups and play with the pace that the Pacers play with and all that different stuff, right? Part of that is their system. Part of that is their coach, Rick Carlisle. But a big part of that is the personnel that they have, and it allows them to play that kind of style. So you can't just sit here and look at other teams that are having success and say, hey, we're going to do that, and it's going to work for us. But I will say this, Ethan. These playoffs have shown that there still is a place we understand. Offense dominates. It's pace and space era, 3-point shooting era, and double-digit leads can be wiped away so quickly today. But there's a place for defense in this NBA still. Look at some of the teams that have success in the playoffs. The Celtics have the number 3 defense in the postseason. The Timberwolves have the number 4 defense in the postseason. The Mavericks have actually become a better defensive team. They're number 6 in defense in the postseason. The Thunder, who were a conference semifinalist, are number 2 in defense. And the Nuggets, who were a conference semifinalist, 7th in defense. The Cavs, who were a conference semifinalist, 8th in defense. So yeah, like you have to score. There's no doubt about that. You've got to be able to make outside shots. You've got to be able to spread out these defenses and stuff. But a number of the teams that have been successful so far in the playoffs, and some of the ones that are still playing, besides Indiana, of course, which just doesn't care about defense, they are not defense first, but they're in that conversation of the kind of defense that you need to have to complement an offense and have postseason success. And if the Cavs are still going to be a team that wants to have a defensive first identity based on their personnel, and the Cavs are going to continue to make that the focal point as they try and add different pieces to this roster, there's a reason to believe that that can still play and that can still work in the postseason because we're seeing it work.
So that kind of gets into our next point, and we're going to get into these questions shortly. But as Chris said, you don't want to completely look at somebody and be like, that could work for us. We should do that, replicate it. But the Cavs are kind of doing what the Timberwolves are doing with the 2 big lineup and Evan Mobley and Jared Allen. And that is a decision.
Big caveat.
Yeah, that's a decision to come this offseason of whether or not they'll stick with it. But, Chris, I want to get into these subtext questions, man, and I'm going to try and do the computer thing again so I don't get yelled at about using my phone and looking up stats. But, y'all, here we go. All right. These are questions that subtexters wanted to ask Koby Altman. And I wanted to just get your thoughts on some of these questions, and if you think they're valuable enough to maybe use them in the press conference that we might have later this week. So, first one is, what style of offense do you prefer? a wide open 4-out 1-in concept, or a more traditional 3-out 2-in offense? And I think that's funny because of what we just discussed. But next one.
We all know how Kobe's going to answer that, right? We all know how Kobe's going to answer that. He's going to say it's going to be predicated on the personnel that we have.
Next one. Didn't the way the Cavaliers and Coach JB overcame all the injuries to make the playoffs, win a first-round series, and be somewhat competitive against the Celtics in a greatly undermanned situation point to bringing back the coach and the core four, assuming Mitchell wants to be here? Won't the internal improvement of the young guys, plus adding what we can, but plus adding, no, I'm sorry. Won't the internal improvement of the young guys, plus adding what we can in remaining areas of need to be enough to challenge for a championship? Thanks. That's from Brian in San Diego. I mean, I think that's an interesting question because, like, you got to think about what they're doing. I think all of these questions, if we are of the understanding that this press conference is going to happen at the end of the week or next week early on, do you think that the moves are going to be made beforehand, Chris? Because I feel like that's going to kind of sway the questions a little bit.
What moves? You just mean
Like
the coaching move?
the coaching move, whether they want to keep Darius Garland or break up the core four, stuff like that.
Well, here's the thing. The only teams that the Cavs can realistically trade with at this point are the ones that are eliminated by NBA rule. So
Right.
I would think that if you want to consider a trade for Darius Garland, if you want to consider a trade for Jared Allen, you want to have the entire pool available to you, and you want to give this an opportunity to see what direction a team wants to go in, who's going to be willing to move some pieces that they have on their roster, which teams are going to be in some salary cap trouble moving forward, so they may have to dump some salary, or they may be willing to take some salary if a team is a rebuilding team, something like that. So um, I think those kinds of moves, the blockbuster type moves when it comes to trades, those things happen as the summer progresses, right around free agency. Once you see where a team stands, what's what, which players are going to be available, like all that kind of stuff. In terms of the coaching decision, look, I'm told that meetings have already taken place between Koby Altman, Dan Gilbert, and JB Bickerstaff. I'm told that they happened either yesterday or the day before. It doesn't seem like it's something that this organization would want to drag out. Um, JB Bickerstaff has built a lot of equity in this organization. He's done a lot of positive things for this team. A big part of why the franchise was able to get out of the rebuild doldrums is because of JB. And I think the Cavs understand that, and I think the Cavs respect that. Dan Gilbert went on the record earlier this year talking about the job that JB was able to do navigating a lot of the injuries and dealing with a lot of the pressure that he was dealing with and the uncertainty of Donovan Mitchell and all that kind of stuff. So I think there's a lot of respect for JB, and I think that's part of the reason why this situation has transpired the way that it has so far. But the belief is that Kobe is going to talk Friday. And I would think that because the conversations have already happened, where both sides have discussed the future of the roster and to some degree the future of JB Bickerstaff as head coach, because those things have already happened, and because Kobe is supposed to talk on Friday, you would think that that wouldn't be something that they want just hanging out there. I would think that they want a little bit of clarity on that situation so that Kobe can address it in a proper way and he can give whatever reason behind whatever decision the organization ultimately makes. It's not a guarantee. He could obviously talk about the situation without something actually happening. He would be asked that, probably the first question that he's asked. But because of the timing of all of this, it does feel like a decision by the front office um, is more imminent than not. We'll put it that way.
Chris also just gave y'all a preview because more than likely he will be the one asking the first question. So if if there is no decision made, you now know, subtexters and listeners, what the first question is going to be before it gets aired wherever they may air it afterwards. All right. Next question comes from Brandon C. from Charlotte. He says, obviously, if JB is our coach going forward, our being the Cleveland Cavaliers, but also if Mitchell is on the fence about staying, what is your pitch for him to stay? And Chris, I don't think we've talked about this question, maybe underlying, but what would your pitch be to Donovan Mitchell? Because I think I know what mine would be.
Okay, what would yours be?
You have so many great pieces around you. You've been able to grow in back-to-back seasons. You now have 2 years under your belt with this organization, with this team. You've been able to see what Evan Mobley can contribute in a playoff setting outside of his first go-round. You have Max Strus, who potentially could be actually moving to his primary position. And if they are committed to that, then Donovan is going to be able to potentially still have the bigs and Evan Mobley and Jared Allen. This is all saying that no moves are made before this conversation happens. But knowing that Jared Allen and Evan Mobley help increase Donovan Mitchell's defense this season to a different level, and also understanding that if they're able to add a real small forward, someone who has been playing the small forward position for their entire career and can shoot the ball, play defense, and actually space the floor, that might just be the missing piece. And I don't think I know we talked about Dean Wade being such a pivotal piece. I don't think it's sliding him to the starting lineup. I think it's keeping him on the bench and allowing him to anchor that second unit if need be. But basically, you have the pieces. You've learned from this coach. You've been able to talk to him and have conversations about what you need as a player. And now you can go into this next season with a new head of steam, knowing what you need to do to get to the next level of that, which is where you want to be, the Eastern Conference Finals.
Yeah, I think that's it, Ethan. I think the best pitch that anybody can make to Donovan needs to appeal to the things that matter most to Donovan. And I think the Cavs have an understanding of that because they've spent the last 2 years around Donovan, learning him, talking to people close to him, having conversations with him about basketball and other conversations with him that didn't pertain to basketball. So I think because they have that understanding, it gives them an advantage. I think the other thing that matters here in this conversation too, Ethan, is that Donovan is somebody who, um, he dealt with a knee issue, and not that he's getting older, but it's something that he has to be cognizant of, right? Tendonitis in his knee, which is the way that he has described it on multiple occasions, is something that he has to pay attention to. He even talked at various points that this offseason was going to be one where he needed to give his knee more time to recover. So he has to be cognizant of that. And coming off a season where he was injured a few different times, and there was a lot of frustration surrounding that, he's got to look at the possibility of locking into a contract and getting that level of security and getting that big payday. It's not to say that somebody else wouldn't give him that payday, but the more and more games you miss and the more and more injuries start to pile up, you think about missing full seasons, you think about your body breaking down. When you have an opportunity to fully cash in the way that he will with the Cavs offering him an extension, it's something that he's going to have to consider. And we understand that when it comes to decision making for any NBA player, there are multiple things that come into play. But there's usually one driving force behind it. And for Donovan, I do believe that that is winning. I do believe that that is competing for championships. So if I'm the Cavs, I say, hey, look, you became an Eastern Conference All-Star starter, an All-Star starter for the first time in your entire career here in Cleveland. You averaged career highs across the board here in Cleveland. For the first time in your career, you were in the MVP conversation in back-to-back seasons. That didn't happen in Utah. That happened here in Cleveland. This is a very good basketball situation for you, and we have shown that. We just advanced to the Eastern Conference semifinals. And who knows what would have happened if Jared Allen would have been able to play against the Celtics? Who knows what would have happened, Donovan, if you played in the final 2 games of the conference semifinals against Boston? Maybe the result's the same, but there's no way for you to know that for sure. And I think you say, what basketball situation is out there that you can reasonably get to that is going to give up what it takes to get you in a potential trade that's still going to have enough left over for you to compete for a championship better than what you can here in Cleveland growing alongside Evan Mobley. If Darius Garland remains, growing alongside Darius. If Jared Allen remains, growing alongside Jarrett. But if it's not Jarrett, if it's not Darius, what can those trades of those 2 guys bring back to our organization? How can that help you progress your career? How can that help us progress forward? We're not in salary cap hell here. We're not against the second apron. We don't have the same kinds of luxury tax issues right now. We still have some flexibility. We still have some trade assets. We still have some money to spend. We have a first-round pick that's coming with the 20th overall pick who may potentially be in this rotation or who down the road could potentially be used as a trade asset. Like all those different things for the Cavs, it's all about the situation, the basketball situation, and why that's best for Donovan to commit to long term.
I
Because
think
like if let's say it's the Lakers, right? What are they reasonably going to give up that will appeal to the Cavs enough to trade Donovan to Los Angeles? Are the Cavs really going to take Austin Reeves and Rui Hachimura and spare parts? Like, what is that going to do for them? Are you kidding me? And if it's like Brooklyn, people continue to bring up Brooklyn, which I don't think Donovan wants to go to the second New York team. So let's say they give up Mikal Bridges or Cam Johnson. What do you have left over there? You gonna latch onto a team with Ben Simmons and Nick Claxton and do what? Compete to avoid the play-in tournament? Like, yes, Donovan is an elevator. Donovan is the kind of guy who makes everybody around him better. Donovan is the kind of guy who just lifts franchises to new heights. But that's a tough ask. It really is. And then Miami's the only one that makes logical sense, if we're being honest. Go there with Jimmy, go there with Bam. The Heat would probably give up some combination of Hero, Jaquez, Jovic, maybe some draft capital into the future. But that's like one situation where if you squint hard enough, you say that is a clear-cut, better basketball situation for Donovan if he gets himself there.
And I think it's funny because, like, we learned this playoff season, the Cavs don't have another star right now. Evan Mobley is still growing as an offensive player. He's a star defensively. Don't get me wrong. He's a star defensively, but he's still learning himself on the offensive end, still learning how to create off the dribble, create for himself, and all of those things. And I don't think they would consider it a full rebuild, but getting rid of their main star, their main centerpiece, the Cavs would need something in return that's like, oh, we can still get back to the Eastern Conference semifinals at least if he's gone. And I don't think Tyler Herro's doing that. I don't think a second-year Jamie Jaquez Jr. is doing that. I don't think Jovic is doing it. What do you say?
Jaime. You are
I love it here.
notorious for mispronouncing people's names.
I love it. I love it here. I love it here. I love it here. But also, I love to tease the subtexters and the listeners a little bit. And you talked about the 20th overall pick and how that could potentially be in the rotation. That could also lure in somebody else that could potentially be in the rotation that is not that draft pick. But you'll have to read between the lines for that one because I don't want to get too into the weeds on that one. Anyway, but I want to run through just a couple more of these questions rather quickly, just to get what you think about what our subtexters are thinking, Chris, and what's going through their heads, especially after the information that we've been giving them all season. Next one is, do you feel JB had the right pieces to work with to go further in the playoffs this year? There were long stretches again of struggles on offense. The next question is offense ? How can we continue to grow and put together schemes like that? The next one, I would ask him how he assesses or grades his position as general manager / president. How confident is he in re-signing Mitchell? If they let JB go, will Mitchell have input in next hire? Those come from Scott in Greensboro. Oh boy.
I will say that I do have on my list, I have a running list of questions for Koby for Friday. Well, what's expected to be Friday. And one of them on my list is how much input will Donovan Mitchell have in the offseason?
I think that's
really important.
Yeah, I think that's a good one.
I mean, I think Koby has a canned answer ready for that, but I think the question needs to be asked.
I mean, to be fair, Chris, he surely was around the world doing and attending other events, but you mentioned it. He's had meetings with J.B. Bickerstaff and Dan Gilbert potentially, and there's going to be a lot of canned answers because he's had time to prep them. But we got to ask these questions and do our job. Right. The next question comes from Alec from Chicago, and he says, I see J.A. has unfollowed the Cavs on Instagram. Is that anything? What thought process is trading J.A. over Garland, who fits clearly worse with Donovan and generates very fewer threes? Is this your sense of the situation? I think this is more of a question for us rather than Koby Altman. But, I mean, to be very fair, Jared Allen isn't on social media a whole lot. I don't even know if I know Jared Allen's. I know his handle on Twitter, but I don't know it on Instagram off the top of my head. But I will check on that. But, Chris, while you answer, I'll do that while you answer.
Okay.
Who do you think is a better trading piece between Jared Allen and Darius Garland at the moment?
I think the Cavs would get more value for J.A. Number one, he's coming off a better season. Number two, he has a better, more team-friendly, affordable contract. And it's easier to match salaries when you're talking about $20 million as opposed to $34, $35 million. And even though I think there are people that would definitely want Darius and feel like in their system, with their team, with their supporting cast, that they would get the best out of Darius, because that's how people tend to look at these kinds of things, especially young players that have all-stars attached to their resume already. I just think there has been so much interest in J.A. in the past. The Cavs have gotten numerous calls about him because of his contract, because he is low maintenance, because he still has untapped offensive potential, because he's one of the league's best rim protectors. He can switch on the perimeter. He's an elite pick and roll big, and the game is so pick and roll heavy. It's one of the most important things to have in today's NBA. Look at how that has elevated for Dallas, having somebody like Daniel Gafford and Derek Lively, to pair with Kyrie Irving and Luka Doncic, and how that has helped change their offense to have that elite roller, that elite lob threat, the guy who can create some vertical spacing. It's changed the Mavericks completely. On top of that, Jarrett has shown that his play style and his game impacts winning in a big way. He was one of the league's best rebounders in the playoffs. He was a dominant force for the 4 games that he played against Orlando. So I think like the last recollection of Jarrett, beyond the fact of he sat out the final 8 games of the postseason, was the guy who was the second most important player for the Cavs in their early postseason run, and a guy who was dominating Orlando at both ends of the floor. So I don't think Jarrett has done anything wrong per se. I don't think the Cavs are in a rush to trade him away. But if they get the kind of offers that I expect them to get this offseason for somebody like him, because I do think he has immense value around the league, I do think the Cavs are going to be awfully tempted, more tempted than they have been in the past, because I think there's also an understanding, a built-in understanding, that eventually Evan Mobley is going to have to be a full-time 5-man, and eventually may be here already.
So the report looks to be true, Chris. Jarrett Allen is not following Cavs on Instagram. Obviously, it's harder to check on Twitter, so I was scouring for that information. Could not come up with a conclusive answer to give to our listeners because I don't want to lie about anything. So, but he's not following them on Instagram. I went and checked. Donovan still is, Max still is, and Darius still is. So who knows? But I mean, we understand after the New York Knicks series last year that Jarrett Allen just completely got off social media because he didn't want to see as much of the criticism. And it could be a same situation now because of all the speculation that is happening about his name. Mm-hmm. And I don't know. But here are the last, I think, 2 questions that I have from the subtexters for you, Chris, and we'll wrap up this podcast. All right?
Okay.
So, the biggest question from our subtexters, this is what they said, is the biggest question: does Koby Altman think the current team can win a championship with the Big Four, or does he need to reconstruct the lineup because, as some claim, Mobley and Allen and Mitchell and Garland are too similar? Or how much is it going to cost to keep the Big Four together? And I think that's a good question as well, because Darius is already on a max deal. Donovan Mitchell is more than likely going to get a large contract offer. Evan Mobley is probably going to be a max contract eligible in a couple years, if not already. And then you also have Jarrett Allen, who knows how much he considers his worth to be for this team.
I also believe Jarrett is contract extension eligible this offseason.
So I think that's the best question that we've had today, is how much is it going to cost? Because we know, like we said, they are not in salary cap hell yet, but they could be if they want to extend all of these guys on major deals while trying to keep the surrounding pieces that they already have. What do you think about that point of view, Chris?
Well, I think it's something that the Cavs have to consider, because I think they're going to have to give Evan a massive contract to keep him, and I think they're going to. I think they believe in him, and oftentimes, Ethan, the contract that a team is willing to give to a player is not about what they've done, but what that team expects them to do and what that team expects them to become. You know what I'm saying? You have to have some foresight. And I think because of the upside of Evan and because of the way that this organization has talked about him, downright boasted about him, they're not going to turn around and do anything other than give him a massive contract offer.
I just wanted to hop in and give an example. Darius Garland.
Yeah, sure.
Sorry,
I mean, there are a bunch. There are a bunch of guys who hadn't earned it at the time that they got the contract, and all of a sudden they play to that level. It happens all the time. It's not a guarantee, of course. That could certainly backfire. But for Evan, his floor, this is his floor, okay? One of the most impactful defenders in the entire NBA. That's his floor. And now you start thinking about his potential ceiling and some of the flashes that he showed in that series against Boston, and the flashes that he showed in the series against Orlando, and the flashes that he showed at various points throughout this past season, and his ability to rebound and run and initiate offense that way. His ability to catch the ball in the pocket and become a playmaker from there, a decision maker from there. The touch that he showed with the left hand and the right hand around the rim. The improvements that he made in terms of the look of his outside shot. You start thinking about the offensive potential combined with what kind of player he already is on the defensive end of the floor and the player that he'll remain on the defensive end of the floor. And that's the kind of guy that gets $25 to $30 million a year, right? That's the kind of player that everybody is going to want moving into this next era of the NBA. So it's pretty clear that he's going to get paid. The Cavs are going to want him to stick around. And that means when you start doing those kinds of things, it means you do have to be a little bit more responsible. You do have to be a little bit more aware of the salary cap. The one thing that I will say, the benefit that the Cavs have is that Dan Gilbert's willing to go into the tax for the right team in the right situation. Dan Gilbert is probably going to be willing to go into even steeper penalties for the right team, for the right situation, if he believes that the team is capable of winning a championship, because he's done that his entire career and because he is so driven by winning. So that certainly helps, but it doesn't mean that all of a sudden the Cavs can ignore the rules and they don't have to worry about all of the bloated contracts that they have on this roster. I think that comes into the equation when deciding whether or not to move on from Darius Garland and split his contract in a way amongst multiple players instead of just one guy, right? Or Jared Allen trying to split his contract into multiple players as opposed to just one guy. Those are all things that the Cavs certainly have to consider. The other thing that helps them, if we're trying to paint the entire picture here, Ethan, Sam Merrill is on a very team-friendly contract. Dean Wade is on a very team-friendly contract. And Craig Porter Jr. is on a very team-friendly contract. And theoretically, all three of those guys could be regular rotation players.
We already know how I feel about CPJ from earlier in this season, so I'm not going to say too much, man. We know how the fans felt about not really having a true backup point guard down the stretch of the playoffs when CPJ was out and almost every other guard except for Darius Garland was out for the Cavs. But I don't want to get into too much else because we got 3 more podcasts to do, or a lot more podcasts. Yeah, so we'll split it up, and we got to get we got to get ready for the interview with Koby Altman, which is supposedly going to be on Friday. So thank you to all our subtexters for sending us your questions and allowing us to kind of give you our insight on whether we'll use them or not going forward. But if you want to send in your questions and get your insight and give your opinions on things, you can sign up for Subtext as well. So, with all that being said, that'll wrap up today's episode of the Wine and Gold Talk podcast. But remember to become a Cavs insider and interact with Chris and me by subscribing to Subtext. Sign up for a 14-day free trial or visit cleveland.com/Cavs and click on the blue bar at the top of the page. If you don't like it, that's fine. All you have to do is text the word STOP. It's easy, but we can tell you that the people who sign up stick around because this is the best way to get insider coverage on the Cavs from me and Chris. This isn't just our podcast, it's your podcast. And the only way to have your voice heard is through Subtext. Y'all be safe. We out.